Abe, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
Yeah, man, I'm excited. So I'd like to start by talking about your writing because I've enjoyed reading through some of the articles on your website, and one that stood out to me was timeless lessons learned from my high school basketball coach.
Mhm.
I liked this one a lot, and my favorite lesson from the article was master the fundamentals. And you talked about the dreaded shell drill at the beginning of
Yes.
every practice. And it sounds to me like this drill helps with defensive positioning. And it sounds also like your coach had the philosophy that thinking on the basketball court slows you down. So things like positioning need to be second nature. Now, I'm interested how you've applied this concept to life outside of basketball.
Yeah. So my high school coach is and was and is still a great coach and a tremendous influence on my life. I think, mastering the fundamentals that he drilled into us on the basketball court is obviously a principle that can translate to life. And some things I thought of when I think of that principle is the fundamentals in life are just that, the fundamentals. So it's, for me, it's about eating right, sleeping right, exercising a lot of sunshine, and treating people well. Those are things that never go out of style, but it's pretty hard to do that, all those on a pretty consistent basis, especially in the world we live in, where it's easy access to fast food. It's easy to stay on your phone for a while, and then it's also easy to just scroll Netflix for a while. So I think those are kind of foundational principles, not only in the sports world, but as well in life. And that's why my wife and I really try to do a good job of sleeping well and eating right. Because if you have those nailed down, then your career and the other more advanced things kind of fall into place.
Yeah, so it seems like these fundamentals are habits that you've built. And from reading your writing, I can tell that you're like really big on habits and breaking down either big things or just foundational things into small pieces to make them into habits. So, like, how have you made exercise or sleep or your diet these big things? How have you broken them down to make them into, I guess, like atomic habits, to use a phrase from James Clear?
Yeah. Obviously, Atomic Habits is a foundational book for a lot of people, and especially myself, because I started reading his blog, way back when I was in college. So it was really nice to get kind of the comprehensive book. So in terms of, let's use, for me, sleep was a big game changer when I was in college. Like most other folks, you stay out late, you don't particularly eat well, you might go to cookout late at night or what have you. Then transitioning into more of the corporate, 9 to 5 life, as well as early on coaching high school basketball on the side, it was really important to make sure I got a solid 8 hours of sleep. And for me, it's a couple things. So one is caffeine intake. I realize that I just can't have any caffeine pretty much after 1 p.m. If it's after 1 p.m., then I'm gonna stay up. And then two, it's about, for me, setting out all these creating a habit, a small habit where I prepare everything the night before. So that's, taking out my lunchbox, putting my clothes right outside the bed, grinding coffee beans, etc. So for me, I want to wake up and be able to hit the ground running instead of spending the first 30 minutes kind of scrambling to get ready. So sleep was a big game changer for me. And it was primarily driven by the insight that I couldn't really drink caffeine. Once I reduced my caffeine consumption to morning only, that was really a big game changer. And I was able to fall asleep relatively early for me.
One thing I've noticed about having productive mornings starts the night before. And
Yep.
so you talk about like laying out your clothes and packing your lunch or whatever. I noticed that if I just spend 5 or 10 minutes right before I go to bed writing down 5 or 6 things I want to do in the morning, then I can wake up and I don't have to think about the things that I need to get done. I just look at the list, pick one of the things, and start working on it. But what's really interesting is that if I don't make that list, I might have 2 or 3 hours in the morning where I just putz around, scroll Twitter, like don't really accomplish anything because the act of like deciding what I need to work on is such a barrier for me. But by just doing that the night before, I'm 10 times more productive. Do you like make lists and do things like that?
Yeah. It's a very timely question, because right before we hit record on this, Joe, I did a weekly review, where it's where I kind of look back at the previous week, look forward at my week from two contexts: one, professionally, as well as personally. And what I like to do is jot down, 3 to 5 bullet points of what needs to get done this week, both professionally and personally, and then make the plan to do that. So for example, if I know I'm going to work out 3 times this week, I try to slot in based on my upcoming schedule, whether it's going to be in the morning or evening in the week, and on what days of the week, whether it's, I like to do a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but sometimes the schedule just doesn't work out the way. Then similarly, professionally, I'm sure, Joe, you know all about, Cal Newport's deep work concept. And so I try to block out, in an ideal world, it's the first 2 to 3 hours. Frequently, it's been even just 1 hour, but I try to outline what those mornings look like from a deep work perspective. What are the big rocks, so to speak, that I need to make progress on? And then once the meetings start at 10 or 11, I can kind of be satisfied that I made big progress on the to-dos. And I like to do that, from a weekly basis, like I mentioned, but then a daily basis as well. So Monday, as I'm wrapping up my work day, I'll try to tentatively sketch out what the next day looks like in terms of, okay, what progress did I make today? What do I want to make tomorrow? And how's my weekly plan shaping up? So the weekly planning is not really a static document, it's more dynamic, but it's really helped me kind of take more control, especially as the professional and personal obligations have increased.
Is the weekly planning your version of journaling, or do you journal in addition to that?
Yeah, so I not journal, so to speak, but I do capture. I do have a list of daily metrics that I like to track, and I have a phone alarm that goes off, every night at 8 or 8:30, where I write down the specific metrics that I'm looking to track, and I outline these metrics at a different scale of planning. So I like to do a quarterly plan, which is even more zoomed out of what I want to do in a professional and personal context, as well as whatever experiments or challenges I commit to. And those metrics that I track are ones that you might expect, right? So for example, one is 30 minutes of reading a day. So if you read 30 minutes a day, it's something that's tractable even on the busiest of days, but it's also impactful enough that if you read 30 minutes a day for a whole year, you're going to get through a lot of books. So those are the types of metrics I like to track. And it also encourages that behavior, because if I know I'm going to write it down at the end of every day, then I don't want to write down an X. I want to write down a check mark. So even if it's 7:30 or 8, and I know I got to write it down by the end of the day, I'll flip open a book and read for 30 minutes.
It's cool how just tracking those little things makes you so much more likely to do them. Like I think it's also James Clear who talks about not breaking the chain, or maybe it's Jerry Seinfeld. I don't know.
Yes.
It's one of those two. So like you see all those check marks on the calendar, you don't want an empty box. So you just do that thing.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And it's advice that is so simple that it seems silly. It's like, surely that couldn't work for me. But it really, ever since I implemented it, a year or so ago, I felt like I've made a lot of progress in some of the key areas, such as reading or working out, or, the deep work as well. And so like I mentioned, deep work is another critical thing for me to track. And I don't want to write down an X. I want to write down a tally or 2 each day, because similar to reading, an hour or 2 of deep work each day is not as much as I would like, but that accretes over days and weeks and months. And you can look up at the end of a month or a quarter and say, wow, I got a lot more done than if I had, tried to squeeze in 30 minutes of deep work at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's amazing how it really doesn't take that much time or focus to accomplish a lot of things. It just takes consistent time and focus. So if you make that time, even if it's just an hour a day, you really do get a lot done by just doing that every day.
I completely agree. And it's been a life-changing realization once I kind of embraced that, instead of saying, I need to work out 90 minutes a day, or I have to read for 2 hours a day. Try to make it as simple as possible, as doable, but not too hard where it's, like the 2 hours a day of working out.
Another one of your articles I liked was 28 lessons in 28 years. So these articles, I'm a sucker for these. Like I just can't get enough of them. And there were a few of your lessons that stood out to me. The first was, think of your beliefs like clothing, not tattoos. So I've heard this concept a bunch of times, but I don't think I've ever heard it put that way. And I like that way a lot. I'm interested, what is one belief that you've held but later changed?
Yeah, and so first, to be clear, I didn't think of it as well. I heard similar things, similar to you, Joe, and this is the phrasing that really resonated with me. So one, and I'm sure we'll get into it, later is the follow your passion as as career advice. And don't get me wrong, there are some people who have this innate passion and they spend their whole life doing what they love, and more power to you. But that's something I bought into early on in my career. And then how I transitioned is thinking kind of more long-term about what I wanted to do from a lifestyle perspective, 20, 30 years down the line. And so that's one belief I really changed primarily due to one book, which I'm sure many are familiar with, but I read it at a pretty formative time for me. It's called by Cal Newport, So Good They Can't Ignore You. That's where he talks about the passion, the passion hypothesis versus his thesis, which is, building a meaningful career is about cultivating rare and valuable skills. And then once you've cultivated those skills, you can trade those in for things that resonate with you. For example, some people want to work for 6 months a year and then travel 6 months a year as a contractor, et cetera. So that's really the book that changed my thinking on the passion hypothesis. And it's something that was really impactful for me. So that's one where if I had stuck with my thinking the whole life, I don't know where I would be, but I'm glad I read that book at the time that I did.
It's always an interesting concept to think about, right? Like, do I chase my passion and maybe make less money, but enjoy what I'm doing more? Or do I follow what I'm good at, make a lot of money, and then set aside this time a little bit later to do the things I'm passionate about? And Mike Rowe has a really good quote about this. He says, never follow your passion, but always bring it with you.
Yeah.
And I think that's good advice.
That's a great way to think about it. And it's always something to remember, especially in the time we live in now, where folks like yourself or other people it's easy for them to get out in the world. Whereas, 30, 40 years ago, there was no internet, there were no podcasts that I'm aware of. And so it's much easier to build a career of passion than it was, say, a couple decades ago.
The last two lessons in that article also stood out to me, and they were take a lot of things seriously and take nothing seriously. So I think these are both good pieces of advice, but I'm interested, how do you reconcile those two seemingly contradictory practices?
Yes, it's very contradictory on the surface, and it is something that requires some thinking. And so the way I think about take a lot of things seriously is we only have one life, and we want to maximize what we can do with it, not only from a career perspective, but pushing yourself physically, emotionally, spiritually, whatever resonates with you. So I think it's important not to go willy-nilly and be intentional, going back to having a plan for your quarter or your year or journaling or weekly review. So I think it's really important to be intentional and not just kind of drift throughout life. But then on the other hand, if you take yourself too seriously, you're going to burn out before you can have any fun. So I think it's important to be the first one to crack a joke, even in potentially unfunny situations. And so that's what I like to do. And something that, going back to the startup that I work for, that I like to do before we would get on our pitch is try to crack one or two jokes to loosen everybody up, to remind them that, yeah, we're talking to someone that's really important and can write us a check, but at the same time, it's not all that serious.
I like that. That's great life advice for sure. Are there any things that you take seriously that you think most people don't?
That's a good question. I think of it, sometimes I think of it the opposite way, where I don't take a lot of things seriously that a lot of people do. So for example, something that I have friends that take very seriously is driving, or road rage is a great example, right? So some people, you get in the car with them, and if someone even cuts their way in front of you in traffic, they're going to get angry, maybe say a couple words that I won't repeat here. But then there are also people that just kind of let anything happen. So you don't want to be, I would say you don't want to be on either extreme, but you also want to be okay with people cutting you off in traffic, and not letting it too into you. Because there are some people where if somebody cuts you off in traffic, it'll ruin your day. You don't want that to happen either. And that's something I've really tried to do, is not let little things like that bother me, or somebody cutting you in line at a coffee shop or what have you. So something on the opposite side of the spectrum, my life has become a lot better when I stopped letting little things like that bother me.
Yeah, I find that stoicism helps a lot with that.
Hmm.
Just reading, like even the obstacles of the way was one of the books that has had the biggest impact on me. And then went to the Daily Stoic from that. And just these little passages every day about, you can't control what happens to you, but you can control how you react to it. That's had a huge positive impact on my life.
Exactly. And another example I like to bring up is you can learn a lot from people on how they interact in an airport, right? Because an airport is a pretty structured environment where you have to, everyone has to go through security the same way. You're going to be waiting in line. Most people aren't at their best nature in an airport, but the folks that can remain kind of positive and calm and not get too frustrated are the ones I really respect. And I'm sure everyone's seen people at the airport, and then I'm sure there's many videos on YouTube of people that let the bad things affect them, and it can really spiral down, and you could really cause a negative effect for the people on your flight if taken to the extreme. So I always think it's interesting to observe people at the airport and how they interact. You can learn a lot from that.
I think that could be a good rule before you go into business with somebody is, do they pass the airport test?
That is a good point. And since the company we started last year, I haven't been to the airport with some of my colleagues, so I'll have to keep that in mind whenever we do start traveling, whether they pass that test or not, and I'll have to report back on the next podcast we do together, Joe.
Sounds good. So another thing I saw on your website were your book reports. You have a lot of them
Hmm.
on there. Can you just tell me a little bit about like what they are and why you do them?
Yeah, so for me, like I mentioned before, reading is one of the keystone habits for me. It's probably the keystone habit, and something that I've been doing for years and years. Starting out, like most people in elementary school with Harry Potter, but eventually it's morphed into something a little more serious, where I think of it as some ways a competitive advantage over some other folks. But then also, I just really enjoy it. But one thing that I was thinking about last year is I didn't want to just read. I wanted to retain and explain. And I think the best way to understand something is to speak about it like we are now, or to write it up. And so that's really the genesis of the book reports. Is I wanted to read something, digest it, and then be able to point to some document where I had the snapshots and key summaries of what I've read. And it's really helped me as I've read, not just worry about reading quickly so I can notch another book in my book list, but to really take away the key lessons. And so when I think about that book, whether I should go back to read it or not is, okay, what are the key lessons and when is it appropriate for me to revisit it? So that's really the genesis of the book report writing for me, as a way to digest and explain my books a little better. So it wasn't just reading it and forgetting it.
Yeah, I like that. I find it does help a lot to interact with the information. I've been doing this a little bit with like Twitter threads. I'll just
Yeah.
write up a thread of, kind of what I learned from the book, especially as I think it might help other people. And in just synthesizing that information into 280 characters over and over again, I definitely retain it better, and I'm hopefully better able to apply that at some later point in my life.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect word I was looking for. The synthesis of the information, right? The 280 characters or the one or two sentences. What is the book in tweet format? It's a great way to think about it.
I saw you had a book report on the first book in the Lyndon Johnson
Mm.
series, Robert Caro's series.
Hmm.
Everyone seems to love these books. I have the first one sitting on my shelf behind me here, but it's intimidatingly long. So why should I read it?
So another timely question, because this morning before the weekly review that I mentioned, I'm on the second to last chapter of the fourth book, which is the last published one in the series. So it's a series of 5 books. Robert Caro is in his, I think, mid to late 80s now. He has no official date set for the 5th book, but he's been working on it for a while now. So there's been 4 books published. So I would read it because I think it is a great picture of a United States president who really rose up from nothing. And so there's a lot to be said about pulling yourself up from your bootstraps and building something incredible. And I think the first one really goes into the level of detail. Lyndon B. Johnson really came from nothing in the rural part of Texas. His family was moderately well known in the local region, but he ended up going to a really small college. But I think it's a really good portrait of an American, the crux of the American idea that if you work hard enough, have some fortuitous timing, that you can make yourself into anything that you want. So I think the first book really paints a compelling narrative of the early years of Lyndon Johnson, from it actually starts generations before he was born up until his late 20s, and he makes his way into Washington, D.C. So I think there's a lot to be learned from extraordinary figures, especially those who have accomplished a lot despite the circumstances. And I think that's the tweet length takeaway is how to accomplish a lot despite your circumstances, the portrait of an American president.
So you've read all four. You're almost done with the fourth one?
I have about 40 pages left of the fourth one. Yes.
Wow. Does this series read like a typical biography? Because I like biographies, but I find especially ones of more historical figures are a little bit more challenging for me to get through. They get a little bit dry.
I don't think so. I think that's the greatness of Caro's writing, which I'm sure he's run multiple Pulitzers and pretty much every biography award. I think what made it really interesting to me is not only just a portrait of Lyndon Johnson. There will also be chapters on other key historical figures as well. So in the fourth book, which is around the time that Lyndon Johnson's running for president and ultimately becomes vice president to JFK, there's a whole kind of mini deep dive into JFK, his family, and how he came to power as well. And so I think that's what made it really compelling to me. It's while it's focused on Lyndon Johnson, it also paints key portraits of other United States figures in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, as well as serving kind of as a U.S. history lesson. And I'm afraid I've forgotten a lot of my junior year AP U.S. history. So this was a great in-depth reminder of all that was accomplished and all the challenges of the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
I've never been able to get anyone to say anything bad about that series, so I think I do need to read it.
Hey, maybe just start with 30 minutes a day like me. That's what got me into it. Is I set a goal for myself, and one of my quarterly plans is I want to read this book, the first one by the end of the quarter. So that's 3 months. And I figured if I read 15 to 30 minutes a day, I would knock it out. And sure enough, I did. But I must admit, it is a doorstop of a book. It's 800 to 1,000 pages, I think, for the first one.
Aside from the Caro series, what are a few of the books that have been most influential to you?
Yeah, so when I was 20 years old, after my sophomore year of college, I went to do an internship in Pennsylvania. So I live in North Carolina, so I drove up to Pennsylvania. I had this internship all summer long, and one of the weekends during that summer, as I was browsing a bookshelf, and I found a kind of colorful personal finance book by a guy named Ramit Sethi. And I never heard of him. I didn't really read any blogs or anything like that. And I read the book, and it really kind of helped me conceptualize what personal finance was, especially to more of the millennial generation, and kind of immediate first steps I could take, despite the fact I wasn't making any money at the time. And Joe, you know this just as well as I do, but if you look at why the source of many Americans' problems and stress, money is at the root of a lot of them. So I'm not saying Ramit's book, which is called "I Will Teach You to Be Rich," is the perfect solution, but I think getting started and having a plan in place once you graduate college is a critical step to getting your act together. So I read that at a really foundational moment in my life. Then one other I'll mention is a book called "When Breath Becomes Air." It's about a neurosurgeon who gets diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic lung cancer. And it's written kind of in a memoir style, which was really impactful to me, especially in the line of work that I do. And so I come back to that book pretty much around every Christmas time to reflect and remind myself of how life is very fragile. It could be taken from us in an instant, but the author is just he can approach it from both sides. So the doctor side as well as a cancer patient. So I found that book to be really compelling as well.
And I actually have goosebumps when you talk about that, because I've read that book as well. And
yeah.
It just has that impact on you. It's similar to The Last Lecture by Randy Pausch. I don't know if you've read that one. But
I have not.
That's an excellent book too. He had terminal cancer as well, and he wrote this book called The Last Lecture that was actually based on his last lecture. He was a professor at Carnegie Mellon, and it's like lessons to his kids and just general life advice to everybody. But books like that are they're so good because it forces the author to, they're facing death, right? and it forces them to put life into perspective based on their imminent demise. And that's a condition that I think really brings out a lot of wisdom and knowledge and insight.
Yeah, I agree, Joe. And what really stuck with me is at the time when he was diagnosed, I think he was recently married, and then he ends up moving forward with having a daughter with his wife, and that really stuck with me. Is I'm recently married, I don't have any kids yet, but it kind of forces you to confront how you would act if something similar happened, and it really puts in perspective what's most important. And for me, that's family, friends, and then having a meaningful, impactful career.
Mm. So an interesting note on When Breath Becomes Air. So Paul Kalanithi, I believe, is the author. He passed away from his cancer. There was another book called The Bright Hour, written by a lady named Nina Riggs, and she had cancer as well. I don't know if it was the same cancer. She passed away from her cancer, and her husband and Paul Kalanithi's wife ended up getting married to each other.
No
So
kidding.
there's a book from Paul Kalanithi and a book from Nina Riggs, and then their spouses ended up getting married, which is just like an incredible story, I think.
Incredible story. Now I have 2 books to read.
So last year you read somewhere around 90 books. That's a lot of books. At what age did you start reading like voraciously?
Um, so like I mentioned, the genesis of my reading was like most people, the Harry Potter series, but those only came out, once every couple of years. I think when I became a voracious reader is right around the time I graduated college. So for me, getting a college degree for me was the end of my formal education. A lot of folks go on to, a master's degree or a PhD, but I knew at the time the undergraduate degree was going to be for me, and I didn't want to let up on learning. So I view myself as a constant learner. And I think the easiest way to do that is to read books, because it's the synthesis of somebody's decades of experience and insights, all within a nicely edited 200-page book. There are many ways to do it: YouTube, video courses, etc. But for me, books are the primary way I learn. And I think reading widely and deeply is the way I've been able to most grow. So widely, so it's not just personal development, but it's U.S. history, it's academic studies. I really try to read a diverse set of topics, including fiction. But then deeply, of course, is every day for 30 to 60 minutes, hopefully without fail. So yeah, I've been reading for a while now, and I consider it a core part of my identity. I think reading is more of a tattoo rather than a piece of clothing for me.
This might be a hard question to answer because you've been doing it for so long, but did you notice any changes in your life as a result of reading more?
So for me, I did. I think reading allows you to become more empathetic, because when you are reading, you're experiencing many the author's perspectives. If it's a fiction story, the character's perspectives. If it's a history of the United States, a fellow American's perspective. So it really allows you to understand all the different situations that people can find themselves in, and it allows you to become more empathetic, because naturally we congregate towards folks that are like us and are in similar situations to us. But I think for me, reading is a way to learn other people's perspectives, and allows me to become a more empathetic person. So when somebody does cut me off in traffic, I'm allowed to let it go and imagine that something's wrong, and it's not just somebody being a jerk.
Wow, that's a great benefit of reading books. So when you say that, one book in particular comes to mind for me. It's called Our Towns. It was written by James and Deborah Fallows. So James Fallows is a pilot. He's also a journalist for The Atlantic. And he and his wife, over the course of, I think it was 4 years, flew their single engine plane all over the country to like mid-sized towns and small cities. And they would land at these airports, and then they would go spend a few days in the town getting to know the people in the area, and just what made the town tick, right? And this was kind of leading up to the 2016 election. So it was a very tumultuous time in the United States. And it was really cool because they were able to paint such a human picture of all the people that they met and all the places that they visited. And what they basically concluded was that at the local level, people are able to get along politically because they're doing things to improve their community. They're working together to accomplish tasks that will directly impact them. So they have to put aside any political and personal differences to do that. So it was a cool book because you got perspectives, like you said, from a variety of different people, and I think it did help to make me more empathetic.
Yeah. Interesting.
So we touched on basketball earlier, but I'd like to circle back because I know it's been a big part of your life. Can you tell me who Drew Hanlon is and how you ended up working with him?
Yeah, so Drew Hanlon is a MBA trainer. So he helps star MBA players as well as college players and high school players improve their skills to advance their career, get ready for the NBA draft, et cetera. So when I was coaching high school basketball back in the early 2010s, I made a connection with Drew, and I helped him with a variety of tasks during some of his pre-draft workouts and helped guys get ready for the NBA draft. So I wasn't telling them which drills to do, but I was in the background and doing what I could to support Drew and the rest of his company.
Have you stayed in touch with him?
Yeah, so I do stay in touch with Drew a bit, but I think the biggest satisfaction for me is seeing the success of his clients. So when I worked with him, he had a pretty strong client base, such as Jason Tatum, Brad Beal, and Joel Embiid. But if you follow the NBA, in the last couple of years, those are guys that have gone on to become superstars and MVP candidates. So Brad Beal was one of Drew's first clients years ago, he'll tell you. And Brad Beal was, I think, second in the NBA in scoring this year. Joel Embiid's another one of his clients. Joel Embiid was second in the MVP race this year. And then Jason Tatum, another St. Louis native like Drew. Jason Tatum has been working with Drew since he was 14, 15 years old. Jason Tatum was an all-star this year. So it's been really satisfying for me to see Drew's career skyrocket. And it's all because he does such a great job with the players, not only, of course, from his knowledge and helping these guys improve, but I think the biggest takeaway for me is being around him for a year or two was the relationships he builds with all the players he works with. He truly is in their corner and will do whatever it takes to get them to the next level, not only from a basketball perspective, but he has a lot of wisdom off the court as well.
How were you able to connect with somebody who's like so high profile in that world and then convince him to let you work with him?
I initially connected with him on Twitter. So I would, like most folks, I would ask him for various drills that I could do with my teams. But he was pretty active on the the basketball clinic circuit for a while. So I would see him at a couple of his clinics. I would stay after to ask him questions and then follow up via email with things that I'd implemented. And so we stayed in contact for a couple of years, and then one day on Twitter, he posted a question that he was looking for some help running his pre-draft camp, one of the springs, and I volunteered, and I think I had an inside track for the position, which I ultimately got because he knew me. I wasn't just a name. He knew me. I'd been to his clinics. He knew that I was hopefully somebody that was diligent, that was going to help out. So the genesis really, it's a great case study for the benefits of Twitter.
Yeah, man, I can't say enough positive things about Twitter. I talk about this with almost all of my guests about like how to meet people on Twitter, how to advance your career on Twitter. Like so many positive outcomes are a result of Twitter, at least for me. And I think the same is true for a lot of people.
Yeah, agreed. I'm not on Twitter anymore for reasons we can get into, but yeah, it's such a formative tool for me early on in my career. But I want to make sure that I point out the foundation is Drew's generosity and willingness to give me a chance. I'm sure there's plenty of other guys that were tweeting at him and emailing him, but he's always been very generous with his time to other young and aspiring coaches. And I'm very fortunate that I was able to work with him for a little bit. And of course, he's even better in real life than he is on social media. So it's a time in my career that I look back on really fondly. And I'm just so thrilled to see his company taking off and all the players he's working with doing so well.
That's awesome. So speaking of coaching, you coached middle and high school basketball for a few seasons at least. What were some of the biggest lessons you learned from that experience?
So when you coach at the middle school and high school level, it's just it's still very pure. It's a lot of the players are doing it because they like to do it. And something, one of the foundational things that I wanted to instill in our players is a love for the game. You can speak to a lot of people who loved a certain sport, but then it was a certain coach that pushed them too hard or they didn't like it, so they dropped that sport. So something I really try to instill our players is to have fun playing the game. And of course, it's easier to have fun when you're winning. So we would focus on, improving our skills, competing and getting better, but having fun is something that has become overlooked in this era of sports, where it's about early sports specialization as opposed to playing a variety of sports and having fun. And then one other point I'll make when I transitioned to coaching high school basketball is just again, the purity of the game. If you ask a lot of NBA players and NBA stars what their top sports moment in their life was, a surprising amount of them will point to winning their high school state championship, especially if you're in a state like Florida or Texas or California or even North Carolina, where the high school basketball is just so good and so challenging. It's such a pure part of their lives, and it's really the springboard to a lot of successful NBA players, college or pros. And again, something I wanted to remind our players when I was coaching them is not to let the success you had in high school basketball or high school in general be the peak of their lives. To use it as a springboard to something better, whether it's a scholarship to a free education or lifelong friends, or just learning the skill of working really hard and competing in something that you do. So it's like I said with you, it's a time I look back on my life really fondly, and it's nice to see some of the players that I coached do well in college and maybe in the professional ranks one day.
This sounds to me like a perfect application of your life advice: to take a lot of things seriously, but don't take anything seriously.
Yeah, it is a nice encapsulation. I hadn't thought of that, but it is a nice encapsulation because while I was just an assistant coach at Heritage High School where I coach, we tried to take it really seriously because, of course, we wanted to maximize the team that we had. We had a lot of talent on our team, so we want to do the best we can. But then also, we didn't take it too seriously. I'm reminded there is a viral challenge going on during the last season that I coached. I think it was the mannequin challenge, where it's like, you stay still and then there's a song that plays in the background. But I remember we stopped one practice a few minutes early and we had someone come in and record us doing the mannequin challenge. So it was little things like that I remember more so of the game plan versus a particular rival school. I remember having fun and doing things such as the mannequin challenge.
I love that. So before you were a coach, you were a player. I'm interested how your experience playing high school basketball prepared you for success later in life.
Yeah, so when I was in high school, so my freshman year of high school at Wakefield High School in Raleigh, when I was in 8th grade, they won the state championship for 4A basketball, which is the largest classification in North Carolina. And so let's put it mildly, they're a pretty good program. And so when I went in as a freshman, I actually got cut from the junior varsity team. So I didn't even play for my high school the first year. When I was a sophomore year, I tried out for the team again. I made the JV team. And frankly, I didn't play that much. I definitely didn't start. I made some improvements, grew a little bit, got a little bit stronger. And that's when the high school coach that I wrote about on my website took over. And so he kept me as essentially the last man on my junior year team, a team that wasn't even very good. And then going into my senior year, I was really determined to make the most of whatever high school basketball experience I could. So again, put together a plan with my coach, work really hard, gain some more weight so I could battle down low. Eventually, I was the team captain and one of the first guys off the bench. And I feel like I actually made an impact to winning basketball games that year. But I really look back on it fondly because one is the lessons I wrote up in that article about my coach, who really taught me a lot of foundational life skills that I've taken. But as well as the relationships I formed with some of my teammates. To give you an example, there's a couple of years ago, it was Christmas Eve of all times. I went to Target. Probably, I can't remember why, but I'm sure it was to buy a last minute present for someone that I had forgotten to. And I'd ran into one of my teammates at this Target, and it was like 8:30 at night. So getting pretty late, at least for me. And I spent 30 minutes on one of the aisles in Target catching up with him and just reliving some of the glory days and not so glory days of high school. So it was great to reconnect with them, and social media for sure has made it easier to stay in contact. But I really look back at my so-called career. I was by no means a star player. I think my career high was, 7 points. But being part of a team, trying really, really hard at something, sometimes achieving your goals, sometimes not, and having that, the shared goal to win a championship at some level is something that was just a foundational moment for me. And I take a lot of the things I learned into this new, into my career and into this company that we started last year.
Yeah, being part of a sports team, it's hard to overstate how important that is for development later in life, I think, and being a good employee and a good coworker and all that stuff.
Yeah, and I think one thing I would add is I think it's important to be on sports teams that are really bad and really good. Because when you're on a sports team really bad, sometimes it's a similar situation to sometimes you'll find yourself in life. No matter what you do, the smartest thing the coach could come up with, your best plays, you work really, really hard, and you're still not going to win. That's analogous to everyday life, right? You can try really hard and not get that job position, or not get that person to date you, or whatever. Whereas, of course, we all want to end up winning in the end. So if you're on a really good sports team, you understand what winning is like and what it takes to achieve at that level. And you can apply those standards similarly to the rest of your life. So I was on plenty of good teams and plenty of bad teams. I try to draw lessons from both of those times in my childhood in a professional and personal context.
That's a great insight. All right, Abe, let's finally get to your professional life. So you are the co-founder of Inceptor Bio. Tell me a little bit about what your company does.
Yeah, so Inceptor Bio is a biotechnology company with the foundational mission of advancing cell and gene therapies to cure difficult to treat cancers. So let me back up a little bit from maybe that mission statement. So cancer is a huge problem in our society. Everyone knows this. 1 out of every 6 deaths is from cancer. 10 million people each year die from cancer, and it's not one disease; it's hundreds of different diseases. And cell therapy and gene therapy, these two modalities that have really erupted from a technological standpoint in the last 10 to 20 years. So, for example, one type of a gene editing technology is called CRISPR. Jennifer Doudna recently won the Nobel Prize for her discoveries in CRISPR. Walter Isaacson, the famous biographer of Steve Jobs and Benjamin Franklin, recently wrote a book on Jennifer Doudna that came out earlier this year. So it's CRISPR and gene therapy and gene editing are really coming in to the public mind. And there are some therapies that are being approved officially for treatments in patients. On the cell therapy side of things is where Inceptor has focused initially. So the types of cell therapy we're interested in, one is called Chimeric antigen receptor T cell therapy, which is shortened to CAR T. So CAR T is a type of therapy where these are really, really sick cancer patients. So these are patients that have tried, 7 or 8 different lines of treatment and have not gotten better. And so CAR T for some is a last resort of a therapy. We're trying to push it to more of the first line of therapy, but that's a different story. So CAR T is a therapy where you take a sick patient's cells, you engineer them to identify and attack that cancer, and then you reinfuse them into the patient's body. So it's really, really cool, and it's proven to be really effective in certain types of cancer. So there's multiple of these products targeting different types of cancers that are approved now. And so that's really the core thesis behind the company, is that cell and gene therapy have been advancing rapidly. Cancer is still a big, big problem. And we think we have some unique twists on the CAR T and other therapies to hopefully push these therapies into clinical trials and then years down the line into approved products.
So my understanding of your company is that it's a very unique combination of science, technology, and operations. And where you come in is more on the operations end, right? So you partner with research facilities, research universities to license their technology or their products or whatever. And then on your side, you guys provide the infrastructure to take that technology and move it to the next level to where it's actually a product and where it can actually be used by patients and the general public. Is that right?
That's exactly right, Joe. And that's a pretty standard operating model within the biotech and pharma sphere, which you're in. So a lot of these breakthrough cell therapies that I mentioned that are approved initially started at academic universities or medical centers. And that's something we think we can bring to the table, is that skill set of translating an innovative idea into something like you mentioned that can be in a clinical trial, because there are very rigorous standards for manufacturing and developing these products. The FDA controls that. So you have to, of course, work with them to get it approved for clinical trials and then show efficacy as well. And so, yeah, the genesis in my role is really working with the universities on the technology that we identified, licensing that from the universities, and then our R&D team takes over in terms of translating the idea into a clinical application.
I know when we first spoke, you mentioned to me that you've met with over 80 universities to eventually pick 2 technologies for Inceptor Bio to license. Can you talk me through your process for distinguishing the signal from the noise in all of those interactions?
Yeah, so the analogy we like to use internally here, it's kind of similar to scouting for the NFL or NBA, right? You have your various characteristics that you look for. So if you're scouting somebody in the NFL, you have the measurables, right? So what is their height, their weight, their speed, all those, hand size, all these ridiculous things that they measure. They have the production. So what have they done in college, right? If they're a linebacker, how many tackles do they have? Do they have any sacks or interceptions, et cetera? And then you look at the character as well. So, what is this person like off the field? What are they on the field? What do they like to do? How are they going to fit in the locker room? So there's various things that go into making a selection. And we've kind of applied something similar on the Inceptor Bio side of things. So we have a set of criteria that we look for when evaluating these opportunities, and it's got to match most, if not all of them, because like many other companies, we have limited resources. We have some resources, but we don't have unlimited resources. So we want to make sure that when we're selecting someone to work with, that we're putting our faith in the right people. And actually, just this week, we announced our first partnership with the UNC Chapel Hill, which is right in our backyard. We're naming the portfolio company Fastback Bio, and it's a great case study. As to something we think has a chance of success. So it's a type of CAR T therapy that has some unique properties compared to the other CAR T therapies that are in clinical trials or on the market. So that's really important for us, is making sure these characteristics are met. So is it differentiated? What is who is the inventor of the technology? What university does it come from? What is the data so far? What is the IP status, et cetera? So we have a checklist of criteria that we look at. And of course, the diligence process is very, very strict as well.
What's a typical timeline from when you license the technology to when it might be available for public use?
Yes. So this goes back to, the FDA and the drug development process being very rigorous and very strict. And so you need to hit very certain specific criteria in order for something to be approved just for a phase 1 clinical trial. So for the indications that we're looking at, so these specific types of cancers, the phase 1 trial is usually a very, very small subset of patients. But even to get approved to put something in patients, you have to submit what is called an investigational new drug application, which is called an IND with the FDA. And then once that is approved, then you have approval to start clinical trials. Usually from idea to clinical trial is a couple of years. And then clinical trials are phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. You have to go through all those different phases, which test various different properties and of the drug in order for it to be approved for a doctor to prescribe it. And cancer is a little bit different because these are areas of such high unmet need. But it's usually years from when a company such as ours has an idea for it to even get into clinical trials, and then for it to progress through clinical trials and then get approved. And of course, at any part of that process, it could fail for lack of efficacy or what have you. But I think that goes back to the team that we built here at Inceptor, the people that we have on our core team and then our advisory team have a long track record of taking ideas taking products from ideas to clinical trials. And so we think we built a team that can hopefully help us do that quickly and in a risk mitigated fashion. But unfortunately, it's not like in the tech world where you can have a minimal viable product and go out there. It takes many, many years of development and then ultimately approval.
So then Inceptor Bio wouldn't make money until it's all the way through clinical trials and approved for use. Is that right?
That is correct. So this is how the biotech world works, where you raise capital, and the purpose of raising that capital is to get you to a value inflection point. And those can vary, but for a lot of early stage biotechs like us, a value inflection point is getting approved for a clinical trial or progressing to phase 2 or building out a manufacturing facility, et cetera. So it's not as cut and dry as we raise some money, we sell a product, we have a profit and loss statement, et cetera, et cetera. We don't anticipate, we likely will not generate any revenue until a product is approved, which is 10 years down the line. So it's a very capital intensive business, but the people that are funding us are well informed of that and well aligned with the mission, because the mission is one that is of dire need. But of course, if it goes well, there's definitely potential upside for both, obviously, the patients as well as investors.
You worked in consulting in the biotech industry before founding Inceptor Bio. How were you able to leverage your experience from consulting to start your own company?
So the experience in consulting was an excellent foundational point for me, because it allowed me to do a little bit of everything and really get a holistic view of the industry. So we worked with plenty of biotech companies, so similar to Inceptor Bio, but we also worked with contract research organizations, which are the ones that biotechs will outsource their clinical trials. So there's a lot of I'm based in the Research Triangle Park area. There's a lot of big contract research organizations such as PPD or IQVIA. So I was able to work with a lot of CROs. We also worked with the diagnostic companies. So there's a lot of diagnostic companies that are developing diagnostic tests to hopefully identify and find these cancers before they become metastatic. So I was able to get a breadth of experience across the various subsegments of the industry, as well as just really building a rigorous operations and project management background, because I think that skill set is applicable across industries, and especially, I think, valuable in a startup where moving quickly and progressing rapidly is the core to any startup, because you want to show progress to both yourself as well as investors. So I think that's what I try to bring to the Inceptor Bio team.
I think this is a really important point, how you can use one experience to level you up in a future experience. And I kind of compare this to when I was a kid. We used to use firewood to heat our house. And my dad would always say that splitting firewood warms you twice, once when you're splitting it and once when you're burning it. And I think that work experience is kind of similar in that you benefit from your experience in the present, usually by earning a paycheck, right? But you also benefit from your current experience in the future because it prepares you to do something you otherwise wouldn't have been able to do. So I think it's always good to be asking yourself, how can what I'm doing right now prepare me for something I might do in the future? Or similarly, what does this experience that I'm going through at the present time qualify me to do that other people might not be able to do? And I like how you've done that in your career. And I think that's valuable for everyone to think about at every point in their life.
Yeah, it's well said, Joe. And I love the phrase by your dad. And that's the way I think about it too, is what skills am I developing that I can apply to my current company as well as future endeavors? I hope to work for Receptor Bio for the rest of my life. And so, but I want to always be on the lookout to gain new skills and then apply those to my current and maybe future circumstances as well.
Inceptor Bio is a family company. You founded it with your father. What challenges does that present?
Not so much, because my father is a great guy, so he makes it easy for me. Joking aside, though, it's really interesting to work with your family, and And I think the foundational thing with working with your family is you have to have a good relationship with your family outside of work, right? That's the first and foremost, because if you don't do that, working together is not going to work. It's just going to exacerbate any challenges or issues you may have with your family out of work. I think secondly is to keep it professional at work. So when I'm at work with my dad, I don't call him dad, I call him Shailesh, right? That's just a foundational thing that shouldn't have to be said, but I think that's important for anyone that works with their family. And then lastly, at least for me, the way I think about it is I try to work twice as hard to carve out a niche at whatever role I am. So with Inceptor Bio, I work hard to carve out a niche to make sure that while, yes, may have gotten the job and keep due to family connections, I want to make sure there's no doubt in anyone's mind that the reason I'm keeping the job is because I'm providing hopefully valuable skills to the team. So that's the way I think about working with family. It's wonderful, and I wouldn't have it any other way. And I love working with my family, but it is certainly a unique circumstance, especially within the industry.
Yeah, I think that's valuable perspective for anyone who works with or for their family.
It is interesting. I'll put it this way: I'm never bored at work for one reason or another.
That's a good thing, I think.
I agree.
All right, Abe, I like to give my guests the opportunity to ask me questions. So is there anything that comes to mind?
I have one for you, Joe. Since you recently moved down to North Carolina, and I'm a North Carolina resident and lifelong native, what is the best place in North Carolina that you've tried so far, whether it's eating, drinking, or any kind of other establishment?
That's a good question. We've been to a handful of places, a few breweries, few places to eat. I think I'm going to have to say Crafted, which is right in downtown Greensboro, and it's a taco place. And it's not like a typical Mexican taco place. They have their signature taco is called the Big Truck, and it's mac and cheese, pulled pork, and then a couple other toppings on there. And it's incredible. And it's a cool setting. They have PBR is like their signature signature beer.
Really?
And so they have PBR stuff all over the walls, and they have $1.50 PBR drafts, which is like killer deal. Even if you don't like PBR, it's still kind of have to drink it when you're there. So that's a cool spot that I would recommend people check out if they come to Greensboro.
Awesome. And nothing screams the South more than mac and cheese and pulled pork in some capacity. So I'm not shocked that people found a way to put it on a taco, but I've never been there, never heard of it. So I'll definitely have to check it out the next time I'm in Greensboro.
Yeah, man, come on over. We'll go out together.
That sounds great.
All right. I'd love to finish our conversation by asking you some rapid fire questions.
Let's do it.
What advice would you give to a smart, driven college student about to graduate?
One, I would say get really good at money, career, and fitness. So money, control, personal finances, whether it's Ramit Sethi's book that I recommended, or if you want to go the financial independence, retire early. Career, cultivate rare and valuable skills as quickly as you can, and use those to build a career that you love. And then fitness, find what works for you for fitness, whether it's CrossFit or yoga or powerlifting, and do that at least 3 times a week.
Great advice. What is a favorite mental model you use in your life?
There's 2. So the first is another one that I got from Ramit Sethi, the author of I Will Teach You to Rich. And it is, if you're interested in a book, just buy it. The worst case scenario is you wasted $10 or $15. The best case scenario is that it changes your life. So that's something I follow pretty regularly. My wife can attest that I have stacks of unread books everywhere in the house. And then the second is don't waste time on minor life decisions, such as whether to buy a latte or a cappuccino.
Those are both fantastic mental models. So I know you said you're not on Twitter anymore, so maybe this is a throwaway question, but do you have a favorite Twitter follow from when you were on?
So the first is Morgan Housel. I think his writing is just absolutely terrific, and his tweets are just as good. The second is who we mentioned as well, James Clear. I've been following him since he was writing twice a week on his blog back in the day. He doesn't post as much on Twitter, but I always find his tweets to be quite insightful. So those are 2, although I don't have a Twitter account, those are 2 that I recommend to anyone, as I'm sure their Twitter content has been just as good ever since I quit Twitter.
2 solid follows for sure. All right, last up, this is a question I borrow from Patrick O'Shaughnessy. What is the kindest thing anyone has ever done for you?
The one that came to my mind is so I went to a Catholic middle school, which was a very small school. And then, like I mentioned earlier in the podcast, I went to Wakefield High School, which was at the time the biggest public high school in North Carolina. So I went from really small school to really big school. And I was a pretty introverted kid, something I've grown out of a little bit. So by the first day of high school, I hadn't made any friends yet at Wakefield High School. So the first day of high school, during lunch, my mom had packed my lunch. I had peanut butter and jelly and all sorts of things. I hadn't made any friends yet. So I went to my first 2 classes. I pulled out my lunch at lunchtime, and I was sitting by myself eating my peanut butter and jelly. And it wasn't the best day in the world so far. But as soon as I was on the second half of my peanut butter and jelly, someone came up next to me, and it was one of my sister's friends. My sister was 2 years ahead of me. So I was a freshman. My sister was a sophomore. One of my sister's friends named Brian came up and sat with me the next to lunch. And Brian was a really outgoing kid. He had a ton of friends, really smart. And he brought over the rest of his friends, and they sat with me during lunch. All he said was, "Hey, this is Madeline's brother. So let's sit with him." And that really ended up sticking with me, because I was just I was having a tough first day, but it reminds me to always sit with somebody who's alone, because it had a big impact on my life, because it's 15 years later and it's something I remember. So that really sticks out to me as the kindest thing someone's ever done. So Brian, if you're listening, thank you.
Wow, that's awesome. I've got a huge smile on my face. It makes me feel really good.
Yes, it makes me feel good as well, even looking back on all these years later.
Abe, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you if they want to continue the conversation?
Yeah, so there's 2 places. So one is my website, which I'm posting on pretty infrequently, but I do occasionally. So it's www.abe-maingi, maingi.com. So abe-maingi.com is my website, and you can find me there, or send me an email at amaingi@hey.com. So amaingi@hey.com. I'm not on social media, so email is probably the best place to get me.
All right. I'll make sure to link to that in the show notes. Abe, thanks again. This was a great time.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate it.